Georg Friedrich Handel was born in the North German town of Halle on February 23, 1685. Halle was not very prosperous, the terrible 30 Years' War which ravaged most of Germany having just ended. Germany at this time was broken up into many small princely states or dukedoms, and at the end of the war power in Halle had moved to the court of the Duke of Weissenfels, about 50 kilometers away. So at Handel's birth things in Halle were at a low ebb. Handel's father, Georg, was the surgeon or doctor at this court, so he was of a professional class, secure in his position at the seat of power, such as it was. At Handel's birth, his father was 63 years old. His first wife had died when he was 60, and as was customary at the time, he married again almost immediately. His bride and the mother of the composer was 32 years old on her marriage, and the daughter of a local Lutheran priest. Their first child died, then came Georg, followed by two sisters. Unlike his great countryman and contemporary Bach, they were born in the same year, who lived out his whole life no more than 100 kilometers or so from his birthplace, Handel was to roam Europe, so little information on his early life in Halle is preserved or recorded, though today Halle is proud of her famous son. Fortunately, the center of his early musical education, the Liebfrauenkirche, still stands. It was here he was baptized, and it was here he received his first formal musical education from the extremely competent organist of the church, Friedrich Wilhelm Zachau. According to Handel's own account, his father was very much against a career in music for his boy, feeling that civil law would be better. It would give him security and a position in life. However, from a very early age, Handel showed a precocious talent for music, a talent that was soon recognized in musical Halle. The father's employer, the Duke of Weissenfels, was extremely interested in music, and as he eventually came to hear of the boy's talent, he was intrigued. The Duke felt the boy should be given his head, and the father had to give way. Under the care of the organist of the Liebfrauenkirche in Halle, the young Handel prospered. Handel's first biographer, a man called Mainwaring, who knew Handel personally, claimed that the composer himself said of Zachau, "The first object of his attention was to ground me thoroughly in the principles of harmony. His next care was to cultivate my imagination and form my taste." The Liebfrauenkirche was fortunate in having in its care an extensive library of music, collected by a recent organist, Johann Krieger. Krieger's collection is still extant, and it meant that Handel could draw on the best of music available at the time to help him develop his talents. Soon Handel's fame as a young performer and composer was spreading, and he often stood in for his good-natured teacher at the Liebfrauenkirche organ. Handel's father died in 1697 when the boy was 12 years old, so his future lay under the direction of his mother and those friends who had his musical development in their care. From Halle, there are stories of a visit to the Elector in Berlin, who was interested in music and under whose musical sponsorship his life might have taken another course. Appointments at princely courts was the usual course for a distinguished musician at the time. This was the pattern for Bach, for example. But by chance, or by the composer's design, this didn't happen to Handel. When he was 17, he was enrolled at the new University of Halle, housed here in the old Duke's palace. At the same time, the organist of the Calvinist Cathedral of Halle was sacked, and the young but Lutheran Handel engaged in the post for a year. This was to be the only traditional music position Handel was to occupy in Germany. Considering that Germany was thought to be a most musical nation, this is quite astonishing. Handel developed an important friendship at this time with the German composer Georg Philipp Telemann. He was 4 years older than Handel and studying in Leipzig, about 30 kilometers away. For Handel, it meant a first contact with the outside world and a first meeting with someone with skills and interests like his own, someone he could fully relate to. Through Telemann, Handel encountered opera at Leipzig, and it was to be the spark that set Handel alight and shaped his future career. Opera at Leipzig was on a small scale, so it wasn't long before Handel turned north to the large city of Hamburg with its growing reputation as a center of opera in its splendid new opera house, here shown on a contemporary drawing of the town. He began playing in the opera orchestra and got a position teaching harpsichord to the influential English resident in Hamburg, a certain John Wayne. Maybe it was at this time that Handel began to realize that music was an activity knowing no national boundaries. In Hamburg, Handel met an energetic musician called Mattheson, who later wrote with some exaggeration about their friendship. According to Mattheson, they even came to blows over who was to accompany certain recitatives. According to Handel himself, Hamburg was a time of furious composition, though none of the music of this period survives. Opera in Germany at the time was a rather curious affair, a mixture of German lied, Italian arias, and French dances, with the German language providing the recitatives connecting the arias in Italian and the dance directions written in French. Efforts were afoot to make more sense of this, particularly under the care of the director of the Hamburg Opera, a composer called Kaiser. With an epilogue written by Kaiser, Handel's first opera, Almira, was presented in Hamburg on January 8, 1705. Handel was 20. Mattheson, Handel's friend, sang the tenor lead, and the opera had about 20 performances, a pretty encouraging start. The libretto by Friedrich Christian Feustking concerned a typical classical tale set at the court of Spain. In other words, intrigue and love in high places. Handel's music was well received. Handel owed a great debt to Kaiser for helping to mount his first opera, and Almira was followed by 2 more operas, the music of which is lost. But Kaiser himself was going downhill, and tastes at the Hamburg Opera were changing. Handel was not put out by all this, and by 1708 he was off, seeking new pastures in the then musical Mecca of Italy. He went first to Florence to stay with Prince Ferdinand of Medici, a music lover he had met in Hamburg. It was in Rome, however, in 1707, that we first hear of Handel making his name as a harpsichordist and composer, playing in the Roman churches and at the concerts put on by various cardinals and aristocrats. Handel met the great Italian composer Arcangelo Corelli, and under Corelli's influence, his interest in writing for the violin developed. His sonatas for the instrument are now a treasured part of the violin repertoire. Also in Rome was Domenico Scarlatti, born in the same year as Handel, and arguably the greatest keyboard player of his age. They played together and appeared to delight in each other's talents, though their styles were quite different. The story goes that on entering a palazzo in Venice, Scarlatti heard a harpsichord being played in another room with astounding brilliance. Scarlatti pronounced that the player had to be the devil or Handel. It was, of course, the unmistakable playing of his friend Handel, and Handel was to charm audiences with his keyboard improvisations till the end of his life. Mainwaring, Handel's biographer, says, "The characteristic excellence of Scarlatti seems to have consisted in a certain elegance and delicacy of expression. Handel had an uncommon brilliancy and command of finger, but also an amazing fullness, force, and energy." Another prelate of the Church of Rome, Cardinal Pamphili, was a keen supporter of music, and on a text written by the Cardinal, Handel produced his first major work in Italy, an oratorio called The Triumph of Time and Truth, Il Trionfo del Tempo e del Disingano. Pamphili was one of 3 cardinals who employed Handel to write music for them, and unsurprisingly they wanted religious music, which Handel was happy to supply. Handel very quickly assimilated what of Italian tastes was new to him. When it came to religion, however, no matter what blandishments were laid before him, he remained a Lutheran Protestant, right or wrong, and that was that. A certain bluntness and a great deal of determination was part of his character, but his fame and success no doubt made this easier to maintain throughout his life than it might have for a lesser mortal than Handel. There had been a scandal some years before Handel's arrival in Rome over opera, so opera in its ordinary guise was forbidden. However, the cantatas the composers wrote had arias and recitatives and dances, so were operas in all but name. There was also plenty of secular music making of all sorts in Rome, and one organizer of such music was a certain Prince Francesco Maria Ruspoli. From the extant records of the music copyists, we know of many Handel works composed in Rome for patrons like Ruspoli. However, true to form, Handel appears to have worked on commissions and never took a permanent post. In 1707, he returned to Florence for the performance of his first Italian opera proper, called Roderigo. It was given under the auspices of his friend Prince Ferdinand, but it was not until he visited Venice that he experienced the kind of success that was to characterize his life. The opera first produced in Venice was Agrippina, with a libretto by the Viceroy of Naples, Cardinal Vincenzo Grimani. The story was set in classical Rome, but it was a black comedy full of cynicism and irony, and musically grander and richer than anything the musical world had heard until that date. News of the musical success of Agrippina quickly spread around Europe. Handel was launched and sought after on all sides by producers who wanted his operas, singers who wanted his arias, and rulers who wanted him to adorn their courts. All the success and demand resulted in a code of practice which Handel followed most of his life, that of reworking masses of his music in various new situations, operas, cantatas, orchestral pieces, whatever suited whatever circumstance. It was as if he had an enormous amount of musical baggage into which he dipped in order to satisfy the very pressing demands of the moment. Usually he employed his own music, but he was not above using the work of others, which occasionally led to embarrassing accusations. For others, however, his plagiarism was considered to be flattery. For them, it was fame at second hand. Usually, a piece reworked by Handel took on its own life, and to follow his operations of this sort is to find that Handel was acutely aware of the subtle psychological effects of one style or melody or rhythm or musical effect in preference to another, and his careful use of them was the secret of his remarkable success as a composer of opera. It is worth remembering that 2 of the world's greatest dramatists, Shakespeare and Racine, sought all the subjects for their plays from earlier writers, so the idea of making someone else's work the basis of your own had well-established precedents. Given that the modern seeking after originality has not resulted in a notable increase in artistic genius, in spite of huge increases in population, perhaps Handel and Shakespeare had a more perceptive view of things than we do today. By 1710, Handel was back in Germany visiting his aged mother, turning down offers here and there and deciding to go to England, least developed in its operatic traditions of all capitals of Europe, so perhaps offering the greatest challenges and freedoms. At the age of 25 then, Handel burst upon the English music scene and launched into an extraordinary career that was to make him more a part of England than roast beef itself. He first went to live at the home of a charming young and artistic aristocrat, Lord Burlington, then 19 years old, at Burlington House in Piccadilly. Burlington was to eventually shine as an architect himself, but this base was an excellent entree for Handel into the upper level of society he needed to support his work. A rebuilt Burlington House is now the home of the Royal Academy of Arts. English taste was ready for the best singers money could buy, and of course the best composers. Handel could hardly have arrived at a better time. Success was, however, built around the singers, and the Italian playwright Goldoni, who also wrote opera libretti, maintained that unless you wrote 5 arias for the lead singers, 3 each for the second leads, and 1 each for the rest, the singers wouldn't agree to sing. The singers certainly had a grip of their business. From the start, the indefatigable Handel, who could rattle off a new opera in 2 or 3 weeks, was involved in all the details and problems of opera production, just as were later composers like Wagner or Verdi, who made opera their total musical life. Handel had, for example, to engage the singers, which meant many trips to Italy. He supervised the sets and costume designs, rehearsed the orchestra, helped to raise funds, and above all, of course, conducted performances. It would not be far wrong to describe Handel as a kind of human dynamo. As a young man, Handel was regarded as exceptionally handsome and vigorous and of a fine character. Never meek, never without a dry riposte when it was needed, but an unfailingly good leader with many friends and few enemies, and these were likely to be people jealous of his success. Theatre designs of the time show that London was determined to have of the best. In this plan of the King's Theatre Haymarket, the stage was exceptionally deep to allow for the current taste for perspective, something that, of course, only really had its full effect for those in the best seats. Democracy in the theatre was a long way off. The manager of the King's Theatre was Aaron Hill, and he was important in launching Handel in London. He worked out the libretto for Handel's opera Rinaldo from a poem by the Latin poet Tasso, and the theatre's librettist completed it in only 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, Handel himself had finished the music. The speed of the operation helped by his being able to recycle at least 15 numbers from earlier works. A second prominent figure on the scene at this time was John Jacob Heidegger, who was the assistant manager at the theatre and for the next 30 years to figure as the impresario most important to Handel's progress as a composer of opera. Heidegger was also noted for his remarkable ugliness. The leading role in the production of Rinaldo was played by the castrati singer Niccolini. Having proved their voices and their musicianship as boys, such men as he went on to have remarkable and highly paid careers all over Europe until the practice of castration began to die out in the middle of the 18th century. This grand portrait of the castrato Farinelli suggests how successful he was, and castrati such as he were very important to the success of Handel's operas. that Handel's earlier works contain many hero castrati roles which were difficult to perform in the completely different tenor tessitura possibly explains why the operas are now rarely performed. Handel's greatest gift was to bring all the conflicting demands of the Italian opera together, and through the power of his music merge them into a dramatic whole. He wrote many other kinds of music, for strings, for the keyboards, harpsichord, and most brilliantly organ, but opera was his first love, and he was most definitely a man of the new age of enlightenment, in that he wrote very little religious music. In the 19th century, the poet Edward Fitzgerald was to refer to Handel as a pagan. In fact, Handel was known to worship regularly at this lovely old church of St. George's, Hanover Square, quite near his home. Handel was an unusually careful man with money, investing well and buying for himself this house in Brook Street, not far from Piccadilly and the theatres in the Haymarket. He invested well throughout his life and organized his work with care. To help him in this, he brought John Christopher Smith with him from Halle. Smith had been his friend at the university. Smith, and later on his son with the same name, handled the copying and the storing of Handel's music, eventually even renting or loaning out complete sets of various works around the country. As in everything else in life, factions abound in music, and in Handel's days in London there were plenty. There were those who supported Handel and those who did not, for example. His supporters were numerous and powerful as well as being rich, and a group was formed calling itself the Royal Academy of Music. It had considerable royal support, which was set up to promote Handel's operas and ensure that they would be written and performed on a regular basis. This was pretty comforting for Handel. This Royal Academy continued for over 9 years, and although it eventually folded from lack of money, it worked wonders for Handel's operas. Writing and producing operas was what Handel excelled at above all, and it is surprising that today that is not how he is best known. Indeed, while he certainly would be recalled by most people as a great composer, it is not for his operas that he is remembered. Though now, at the end of the 20th century, that situation is changing. In the 18th century, musical tastes shifted about quite a lot. After many years of success with Italian opera, the fickle tastes of the public began to change, and it looked for a while as if Handel's luck had finally run out. He even began to lose money on his opera ventures. Gentleman that he was, he tried to return the money of his backers. They wouldn't have it. So he turned to writing oratorios, opera-length works with a clear storyline, but without staging and costumes, and with the libretti entirely in English. Wisely, Handel went for the best writing. In Alexander's Feast, based on Dryden's poem of 1667, Handel had a particular success, not least because he punctuated the work with stunning organ concertos with himself at the keyboard. This new success underlined Handel's adaptability and his brilliance in many different fields of music. Handel always had the support of good librettists. One of these was the Reverend Thomas Morell, who wrote the words for several oratorios, including Judas Maccabeus. Another librettist was Charles Jennens, who provided the libretto for the first successful oratorio, Saul. Jennens was a wealthy, irascible, and opinionated man, described by Dr. Johnson as a vain fool crazed by his wealth. However, he was also extremely cultured and talented. He provided 2 more libretti for Handel, The Messiah and Belshazzar's Feast, which were to clinch Handel's recovery. With The Messiah in particular, performed for the first time in Dublin, Handel was catapulted onto a new plane. Choral societies the world over have found the oratorios Handel wrote over the ensuing years perfect material for their concerts, and for these alone Handel holds a unique place in the history of music. As a measure of his astonishing fame and success, a statue was put up to Handel long before his death, something quite unheard of at the time, by the great French sculptor Roubiac in the pleasure gardens at Chelsea, known as Ranelagh Gardens. This statue is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Handel was almost always in royal favour. It began perhaps with the music known as Handel's Water Music, published in 1733. It was played on a river party organised for the king, who liked it so much that it was repeated 3 times that first evening. In 1749, he again composed music for a royal occasion, his splendid Music for the Royal Fireworks. This was played at a firework display in Green Park, given to celebrate the ending of a war in Europe at the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Everything went wrong at the display. The music was played first, but almost forgotten in the mess-up over the fireworks, which didn't work properly, and half of the splendid building put up for the occasion accidentally burnt down in the middle of it all. Fortunately, the music survived, and it remains immensely popular. It's difficult to conceive how this gruff German, with his always terrible English accent and dry humour, came to be such a hit with the British people. In the 1740s, Coram's Fields, a refuge for orphaned or deserted children, was founded in London by Thomas Coram, a retired sea captain. The foundation still continues today in its original buildings, and it represented a significant effort by the people of his time to care for the poor. Artists such as Hogarth and Reynolds gave their support, and along with Hogarth, Handel was made a governor on the king's recommendation. In 1749, there are records of a concert given by Handel to raise funds for the chapel of the refuge. Handel never forgot his old friend Telemann from his early days in Leipzig, and though the two never met again, there is evidence of Handel's thoughtfulness in a great effort he made to send his friend some exotic plants. He knew of Telemann's passion for botany, and though Handel had to make 2 attempts to send them, at one point he was falsely informed of Telemann's death. The generous and persistent effort is typical of Handel. This old lady, Mrs. Delaney, first met Handel when she was 10 and he was 25, and she remained a staunch friend and supporter of the composer throughout his life. But even she, who wrote copious diaries and knew him well, tells us little of Handel the man. He never married, and we have no evidence he had any affairs. He appears to have been entirely taken up with his work. In his late 60s, he began to go blind, but he was supported by his many friends, in particular John Christopher Smith the Younger, who continued to promote his music and put out new arrangements at Handel's direction. Handel wrote little more, but he continued giving concerts on the harpsichord or organ right up to the end of his life. It seems his amazing gifts quite undiminished. Handel was doing what seemed to come so naturally to him, and what gave so much delight to his fellow men. He died on April 14, 1759, in his house in Brook Street, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey, the highest honour the nation could give him. He was 74 years old. Roubiac did the memorial statue of him, reckoned to be a fine likeness. Handel's personal life may have been rather bleak, but in serving music as he did so splendidly, and his huge and enduring public so well, he surely had good cause to be satisfied with his life's work.